Brethren, the path to greatness in the Lord's service is not paved with ease, but with trial, suffering, and refining fire. The Master does not send forth untested soldiers, nor does he anoint vessels unpurged of dross. 3 harsh tests he appoints to those whom he would make mighty. First, the trial of affliction. The furnace of suffering purifies as gold is refined. The Lord smites not to destroy, but to strengthen. He breaks before he builds, wounds before he heals, and casts down that he might lift up. Second, the test of waiting. Delay is the whetstone of faith, the crucible in which patience is forged. The promise tarries, the heavens seem brass, yet the soul must trust when sight fails. The Lord is never late, though he seems slow to our frail hearts. Third, the proving of obscurity. The greatest works are wrought in the secret place before they are displayed in the light. He hid Moses in the wilderness, David among sheep, Joseph in prison. The man whom God would use, he first humbles. These tests are not to harm, but to prepare. Will you endure? God refines his servants through suffering, for the fire of affliction is his chosen tool to purify and strengthen. As gold is cast into the furnace to remove its impurities, so does the Lord place his beloved into the crucible of hardship, not to destroy, but to cleanse and prepare them for his mighty purposes. The untested soul is not fit for great things. It is through the fires of tribulation that a man is molded into a vessel of honor. Look through the pages of Scripture, and you will find that every man whom God has used greatly has first been subjected to deep trials. Joseph, favored and destined for rulership, was cast into a pit by his own brethren, sold as a slave, and wrongfully imprisoned. The vision given to him in youth did not shield him from suffering, but rather suffering was the very path through which the vision would be fulfilled. The chains of Egypt did not signify abandonment, but were the instruments of refinement. In that dark prison, humility was forged, faith was tested, and endurance was cultivated. The Lord was preparing him, though he knew it not. Moses, raised in Pharaoh's palace, was not ready to lead God's people until he had spent 40 years in the wilderness. The refinement of affliction stripped him of self-sufficiency, humbled his heart, and taught him to rely wholly on God. He who once thought himself mighty in speech and action was brought so low that he declared himself slow of tongue, unfit for the task. Only then was he ready, for only then could God's power be magnified through his weakness. The breaking was necessary. The fire was the means of purification. David, anointed king as a shepherd boy, did not ascend the throne in triumph, but was chased through deserts and caves, hunted by Saul and betrayed by those he loved. His suffering was not a sign that God had abandoned him, but proof that God was preparing him. His heart was being refined, his dependence on God deepened, his faith strengthened. Had he received the kingdom without the furnace of affliction, he would not have been the man after God's own heart. Job, a man righteous before God, was not spared from suffering, but was plunged into grief, loss, and pain. His wealth was taken, his children perished, his body tormented, and his friends turned against him. Yet in the midst of his suffering, his faith was purified, like gold in the fire. He saw the Lord more clearly in his affliction than in his prosperity. The furnace of suffering did not destroy him. It revealed the depth of his trust in God. Even the apostles, those chosen to carry forth the message of Christ, were not exempt from suffering. They were beaten, imprisoned, stoned, and cast out. Paul, who labored more than them all, suffered shipwrecks, floggings, hunger, and the thorn in his flesh. Yet he did not count these afflictions as marks of God's displeasure, but as the very means by which he was strengthened. He understood that suffering was not an obstacle, but a pathway to deeper fellowship with Christ. And what shall we say of our Lord himself? Was he not made perfect through suffering? He, the sinless Son of God, was acquainted with grief, despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows. He learned obedience through the things he suffered, though he was already perfect. If the Father did not exempt his own Son from the furnace of affliction, shall he spare his servants? If Christ bore the cross before the crown, shall we expect any less? God does not waste suffering. He uses it to refine, to shape, to mold, and to strengthen. The flames may rage, the heat may be intense, but the hand of the refiner is steady. He watches over his own, ensuring that the fire does not consume, but purifies. Those whom he intends to use greatly, he first subjects to great trials. The dross is burned away, the impurities removed, and what remains is a heart wholly yielded to him, fit for his purposes. God breaks before he builds, for a soul unbroken is unfit for his great purposes. The proud heart, the self-sufficient spirit, and the untested strength cannot carry the weight of divine calling. It is not in the exaltation of man that God delights, but in his humility, not in his natural strength, but in his complete dependence upon the Almighty. The vessel must be shattered before it can be remade, and the foundation must be torn down before it can be built anew upon the rock. Consider Jacob, the man who wrestled with God. In his youth he was full of cunning, relying on his own craftiness to obtain the blessing. He schemed, he deceived, and he grasped at destiny with his own hands. But God had chosen him, and the man God chooses must first be broken. At Peniel the Lord wrestled with him through the night, not to destroy him, but to strip him of self-reliance. When the dawn broke, Jacob was left with a limp, his strength diminished, his independence shattered. Only then did he receive the name Israel, for only then was he truly ready to be the father of a nation. The breaking preceded the blessing. Moses, once a prince of Egypt, stood in his own confidence, believing himself ready to deliver his people. But his strength was untested, his heart unbroken. In his impatience he struck down the Egyptian, believing his own hand sufficient for God's work. The Lord, however, had no use for a self-proclaimed deliverer. Moses was sent into the wilderness, not for days, nor for months, but for 40 years. Stripped of his royal garments, bereft of his former power, he became nothing more than a shepherd in a desolate land. The man who once thought himself mighty became the man who declared himself slow of speech, unworthy of the task set before him. And it was in that lowly state that God called him, for now he was usable. The breaking had done its work. David, the anointed king, was not given the throne immediately, for he had not yet been broken. He first had to flee like a hunted animal, hiding in caves, suffering betrayal, tasting the bitterness of loneliness. The shepherd boy who slew Goliath in triumph had to be reduced to a fugitive before he could wear the crown. The breaking was not punishment, it was preparation. God was shaping a man after his own heart, and shaping requires the hammer and the chisel. Peter, full of zeal, boasted that he would never forsake the Lord. He stood in his own confidence, believing his devotion unshakable. Yet before the rooster crowed, he had denied Christ 3 times. His failure crushed him, his strength proved weak, his heart was broken. But the breaking was necessary, for the man who wept bitterly would later stand boldly, preaching Christ with power, unmoved by persecution. The self-reliant fisherman had to be broken before he could become the rock upon which Christ would build his church. Paul, the great apostle, was not always poor. He was first Saul, the persecutor, the Pharisee, zealous for the law, convinced of his own righteousness. On the road to Damascus, God struck him down, blinding him, stripping him of all he once trusted. He lay helpless, humbled, dependent upon others. His sight was restored, but he was never the same. He was broken, and from that brokenness emerged a man who would endure beatings, imprisonments, and hardships for the sake of Christ. The persecutor became the preacher, but only after he had been shattered. God does not delight in the strength of man, for the strength of man is but weakness before him. He takes no pleasure in self-sufficiency, for self-sufficiency is an illusion. He does not build upon unbroken ground, for the heart must be tilled, the pride uprooted, the soul laid bare before it can be filled with his power. The breaking is not a sign of rejection, but of divine intention. The man whom God would use, he must first bring low, that when he lifts him up, the glory belongs to the Lord alone. Pain precedes spiritual strength, for no soul rises to great heights without first descending into the valley of suffering. God does not grant strength apart from the trials that forge it. The mightiest saints are those who have been wounded deeply, for in their wounds they have learned to lean on Him alone. The scars of affliction are not signs of God's displeasure, but marks of His refining hand, shaping a soul to be fit for His service. Strength is not born from ease, nor does faith grow in comfort. It is in the crushing, in the wounds, in the breaking, that a man is strengthened beyond what he once thought possible. Jacob, in wrestling with God, did not walk away the same man. The touch of the Almighty left him limping, wounded, but transformed. His wound was not a hindrance, but a mark of divine work. He had fought with his own strength all his life, striving, scheming, grasping, but one night in the presence of God changed him forever. He walked with a limp, but he walked in the power of God, no longer trusting in himself, but in the one who had wounded him to heal him. Joseph, betrayed by his own brothers, cast into a pit, sold into slavery and wrongfully imprisoned, bore the wounds of injustice and rejection. The path God ordained for him was paved with suffering, yet through every hardship he was strengthened. The prison was not the end, but the place where God was preparing him for the palace. Had he not endured the wounds of betrayal and hardship, he would not have been fit to govern. His suffering deepened his wisdom, sharpened his character, and taught him the strength that comes from trusting in God's perfect plan. David, anointed as king, was not immediately placed upon the throne, but instead made to flee for his life. He was hunted like an animal, betrayed by those closest to him, forced to dwell in caves and wilderness places. He knew the sting of rejection, the weight of sorrow, the ache of loneliness. Yet in those dark and painful places, he learned to strengthen himself in the Lord. The songs that now comfort generations were forged in the fires of his affliction. He was not made strong in the palace, but in the wilderness, where he had no refuge but God alone. Job, a man declared righteous by God, was stripped of everything: his wealth, his health, his children. His suffering was not a result of sin, but a test that would reveal the strength of his faith. His wounds were deep, his sorrow great, yet in his affliction he clung to God. The strength that emerged from his suffering was not of his own making, but of God working through his pain. The refining fire left him with a clearer vision of the Lord, a deeper faith, a testimony of endurance. Peter, bold and confident, declared that he would never deny Christ, yet when the hour of testing came, fear overcame him, and he failed. The bitter weeping that followed was the breaking of his pride, the wounding of his self-reliance. But Christ, knowing his failure, did not cast him aside. Instead, through his failure, he made him strong. The Peter who once cowered before a servant girl later stood before thousands, declaring the gospel with unshakable boldness. His strength was not in himself, but in the grace of the one who had restored him. Paul, the relentless servant of Christ, bore in his body the marks of suffering, beaten, stoned, imprisoned, shipwrecked, yet he did not waver. His strength did not come from an easy life, but from a life poured out for the sake of the gospel. He spoke of a thorn in his flesh, a wound that God did not remove. Yet in his weakness he found God's strength. The wounds he bore became the means through which the power of Christ rested upon him. Even Christ himself, the sinless Son of God, was made perfect through suffering. The hands that healed the sick were pierced. The feet that walked on water were nailed to a cross. The lips that spoke life cried out in agony. His wounds were not for his own sake, but for ours, and through them he brought salvation. If the Son of God was wounded before he was glorified, how much more must those who follow him be prepared to walk the same path? Waiting tests faith, for God's promises often tarry, and the soul must learn to trust when there is no visible sign of fulfillment. The delay is not denial, but the divine process of strengthening those who would inherit his promises. Impatience is the mark of the flesh, but endurance is the fruit of faith. The waiting season is the proving ground, where trust is refined, self-will is surrendered, and the heart is trained to rest in God alone. Abraham was promised a son, but years passed, and still the promise was unfulfilled. The natural eye saw only barrenness, but God had not forgotten. The wait was not purposeless, for in those years of delay Abraham's faith was tested, stretched, and purified. When he attempted to fulfill the promise by human effort, it only brought trouble, for what is born of impatience cannot carry the blessing of God. But when the time was right, when all human hope had faded, God fulfilled his word, proving that his promises do not fail, though they seem long in coming. Joseph saw dreams of greatness in his youth, yet instead of immediate elevation, he was thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, and cast into prison. His years were marked not by honor, but by suffering and injustice. The promise must have seemed distant, the dreams nothing but fading memories. Yet in the waiting, God was at work. He was refining Joseph's character, preparing him for the weight of the responsibility he would one day bear. If Joseph had risen too soon, he would not have been ready, but through the long years of waiting, he was shaped into the man who could stand in a place of power with wisdom and humility. Moses knew that God had chosen him to deliver Israel, but his first attempt ended in failure. The deliverer was not yet ready, and so God sent him into the wilderness, where he spent 40 years tending sheep. To human reasoning, it seemed like wasted time, but God was preparing him. The impatience of youth had to be stripped away, the self-reliance broken, and the deep trust in God's power established. When the time was right, when the waiting had done its work, Moses was called, and he went not in his own strength, but in the strength of the Almighty, David was anointed king, while still a shepherd boy, but years passed before he ascended the throne. Instead of immediate rule, he was hunted by Saul, living in caves, exiled, betrayed, and constantly in danger. The promise seemed impossible, yet God was not in a hurry. The waiting was shaping David, teaching him to rely on God's timing, not his own. Had he taken the throne too soon, he would not have been ready to reign with wisdom and justice. But the years of waiting forged in him a heart that trusted in the Lord's faithfulness. Hannah longed for a child, and her prayers tested her faith, yet they also deepened her devotion. She did not turn away in despair, but sought the Lord even more fervently, and in the appointed time the child Samuel was given, not only as an answer to her prayers, but as a prophet who would lead Israel. The waiting was not in vain, for it produced a faith that could entrust the child back to God's service. Simeon, the aged servant of God, was given a promise that he would not see death before witnessing the Messiah. Many years passed, and still the Saviour did not appear. Yet Simeon waited, not in doubt, but in expectation, and in the fullness of time he held the Christ builder in his arms, proving that what God has spoken, he will surely fulfill. The apostles were told to wait in Jerusalem for the coming of the Holy Spirit. They did not know how long they would wait, only that the promise had been given. In those days of anticipation, they prayed, they sought God, and when the day of Pentecost came, they were ready to receive what had been promised. The waiting was not empty, it was preparation. God's delays are not rejections. The waiting season is the place where faith is tested and proven, where character is refined, where self-reliance is stripped away, and where trust in his perfect timing is established. The soul that can wait on the Lord without wavering is the soul that will see his promises fulfilled in due time. Obedience is tested in the dark, for it is easy to follow when the path is clear, but true faith is revealed in the shadows, where sight fails, and only trust in God remains. The heart that obeys only when understanding is present has not yet learned the depth of surrender. God calls his servants to follow him into the unknown, to trust his leading when reason cannot comprehend, and to obey when every circumstance seems to oppose his command. The test of obedience is not in comfort, but in uncertainty, where faith must walk forward without answers. Abraham was called to leave his homeland, his kindred, and his father's house, not knowing where he was going. The command was given, but no details followed, only the call to trust. He did not see the land before he stepped out. He did not receive the promise before he left everything familiar. His obedience was tested in the dark, where every step required faith. And when the ultimate test came, when he was asked to offer up his son, he did not hesitate, though the command seemed to contradict the very promise of God. His obedience was not based on understanding, but on trust in the one who had called him. Noah was commanded to build an ark when there was no sign of rain. The world around him carried on as if nothing would change, mocking his labor, ridiculing his faith, yet in the absence of proof he obeyed. His hands worked day after day, constructing a vessel for a judgment that had not yet come. His obedience was not in response to what he saw, but to what God had spoken. Though the heavens remained clear, he did not waver, for his trust was in the voice of the Almighty, not in the evidence of his eyes. Moses, standing before the Red Sea with the armies of Egypt closing in, was commanded to stretch out his rod. The waters had not yet parted, the way was not yet visible, but obedience was required before the miracle could unfold. The command did not come with explanations, only with the necessity of trust. He lifted his rod in faith, and at God's word the sea made way. Obedience must often precede understanding, for the power of God is revealed to those who move at his command. The widow at Zarephath, with only a handful of flour and a little oil, was asked to prepare bread for the prophet Elijah before feeding herself and her son. The command defied reason, for there was nothing left, only enough for one final meal. Yet in her obedience the provision of God was made known. The flour did not run out, the oil did not cease, for the test of obedience became the gateway to divine sustenance. Those who obey without seeing are those who witness the hand of God sustaining them in the impossible. Gideon, with an army too small to count as a threat, was commanded to reduce his numbers further, sending away the many and keeping only a few. The strategy made no sense. The odds were impossible, yet the command was clear. Victory did not come by human might, but by obedience to the voice of God. The strength of an army was not in its numbers, but in its faithfulness to the one who fights on behalf of his people. The test of obedience was in trusting that the battle belonged to the Lord, not to human strength. Peter, after fishing all night without success, was told to cast his net again. The waters had yielded nothing, the labor had already been spent, yet at the command of Christ he obeyed. It was against his experience, against his logic, yet he lowered the net in faith. And in that moment the abundance of God was revealed, for the nets overflowed with fish. The test of obedience is often in the willingness to act even when past efforts have failed, to move forward even when reason says to stop. Paul, called to preach the gospel, was often led where persecution awaited. He was sent into cities where suffering was certain, yet he did not shrink back. He obeyed not because the path was easy, but because the call was clear. His steps were guided not by fear of suffering, but by trust in the one who had sent him. The test of obedience is not found in favorable circumstances, but in the willingness to follow Christ wherever he leads. Even Christ himself, in the Garden of Gethsemane, faced the ultimate test of obedience. The path before him was one of suffering. The cup set before him was bitter, yet he did not turn away. "My will, but yours be done," was the cry of surrender, the mark of perfect obedience. He did not choose based on what was easy, but on what was right. Those who follow him must learn this same obedience, trusting not in what is seen, but in the will of the Father. Isolation is the training ground of those whom God calls for great purposes. Before he uses a man mightily, he first separates him, drawing him away from the distractions of the world, the noise of human opinion, and the comfort of companionship. It is in the wilderness, in the lonely places, that God molds a soul, stripping away self-reliance and teaching dependence upon him alone. Those whom he would fill must first be emptied, and those he would exalt must first be brought low. Isolation is not abandonment, but divine preparation, a sacred season where the soul learns to hear the voice of God above all others. Moses, before he became the deliverer of Israel, was first led into the wilderness of Midian, away from the power and privilege of Egypt. For 40 years he tended sheep in solitude, his dreams of deliverance seemingly buried beneath the weight of time and obscurity. Yet it was in that isolation that God was preparing him. The noise of Pharaoh's court had to be replaced with the stillness of the desert, for only there could he learn the patience, humility, and trust required to lead God's people. When the time came when the burning bush appeared, he was no longer a self-preserved prince, but a man emptied of himself, ready to be filled with the power of God. Joseph, once the favored son, was torn from his family, sold into slavery, and cast into prison. His journey was marked by separation, removed from his home, stripped of his position, and forgotten by those he had helped. Yet, in his isolation, God was at work. The dungeon was not a place of despair, but a school of preparation. In the quiet of that prison cell, Joseph was learning the lessons that would equip him to govern with wisdom, to endure with patience, and to trust in the unseen hand of God. When the day of his elevation came, he was not an arrogant youth, but a man who had been tested in the furnace of solitude. David, after being anointed as king, did not immediately ascend to the throne. Instead, he was driven into the wilderness, hunted by Saul, betrayed by those he trusted, and forced to dwell in caves. His years of isolation were years of refinement, stripping away any illusion of self-sufficiency. He learned to seek God in the lonely places, to find strength not in armies or alliances, but in the presence of the Almighty. The Psalms that have comforted generations were birthed in the solitude of the wilderness, in the cries of a heart that had learned to depend on God alone. Elijah, after standing boldly before kings, was led to the brook Cherith, hidden away from the world. There, in the silence, he was sustained by ravens, a daily reminder that his provision came not from human sources, but from God himself. When the brook dried up, he was sent to a widow in Zarephath, further isolated from the familiar. This season of separation was not a punishment, but a lesson in divine sufficiency. Before he could stand on Mount Carmel and call down fire from heaven, he had to learn in the quiet that his strength was not in his own might, but in the power of God. John the Baptist, the voice crying in the wilderness, was not raised in the palaces of men, but in the desert, far from the influence of the religious elite. His calling required separation, for his message was not shaped by the traditions of men, but by the word of God. His voice carried weight because it was not mingled with worldly wisdom, but had been forged in the solitude of the wilderness, where he had learned to listen to the voice of the Almighty. Paul, after his dramatic conversion, did not immediately begin his ministry, but was led into Arabia, into a place of seclusion. There, away from the distractions of the world, he was taught by God, prepared for the mission that lay ahead. His letters, filled with divine wisdom, were not born from the influence of human teachers, but from the deep wells of revelation drawn from seasons of isolation. Before he could stand before kings and proclaim the gospel, he had to first be hidden away, alone with God. Even Christ himself, before he began his public ministry, was led by the Spirit into the wilderness. For 40 days he was alone, fasting, facing the enemy's temptations, proving his obedience and trust in the Father. The wilderness was not a place of weakness, but of strengthening, a place where his dependence on the Father was revealed in its fullness. Those who follow him must expect the same path, for the greatest works of God are often preceded by seasons of solitude. Betrayal is a bitter cup, yet it is one that God often allows his servants to drink. It is in the sting of rejection, the pain of disloyalty, and the wounds inflicted by those once trusted, that a soul is refined. The ones closest, those who once walked in fellowship, those who once spoke words of love and trust, are sometimes the very instruments through which the deepest hurts are inflicted. Yet God does not allow betrayal without purpose. He uses it to sever unhealthy ties, to reveal the true nature of hearts, and to draw his chosen ones closer to himself. Those who would do great things for God must be tested by betrayal, for through it they learn to lean not on man, but on the unfailing faithfulness of God. Joseph knew the pain of betrayal. His own brothers, those who should have protected and cherished him, turned against him. Out of jealousy, they cast him into a pit, sold him into slavery, and abandoned him to a life of suffering. He had done no wrong to them, yet their envy was stronger than their brotherly love. In a moment, he lost his home, his freedom, and the security of his family. Yet what they meant for evil, God meant for good. Their betrayal was the very thing that set him on the path to his divine purpose. Without the pit, there would have been no palace. Without the rejection of his brothers, there would have been no rise to power. What seemed like destruction was, in truth, preparation. David, anointed to be king, faced betrayal not only from strangers, but from those he had faithfully served. Saul, whom he had honored, sought to kill him. The very man he had fought for, the king he had defended, turned against him in jealousy and fear. David was forced to flee, to live as a fugitive, to hide in caves while his enemy sat on the throne. Later, even his own son, Absalom, turned against him, conspiring to take the kingdom by force. The sting of such treachery could have broken him, but through these betrayals, David learned to trust in God alone. The throne would not come by his own striving, but by the hand of God. His betrayals did not hinder his destiny, they prepared him for it. Jesus himself was no stranger to betrayal. Judas, one of his own disciples, one who had walked with him, heard his teachings and shared in his ministry, sold him for 30 pieces of silver. The price of a slave was all it took for Judas to turn against the master he had followed. And yet Jesus was not taken by surprise. He knew from the beginning who would betray him, yet he still washed Judas' feet, still shared a meal with him, still called him friend. The betrayal did not derail God's plan, it fulfilled it. The cross, which seemed to be the enemy's triumph, was in fact the victory of God's redemption. Betrayal did not destroy the work of Christ, it accomplished it. Paul, the great apostle, knew the pain of betrayal as well. He wrote of those who had deserted him, those who had once stood by his side, but later abandoned him in his trials. Demas hath forsaken me, having loved this present world. Later he lamented, to be left alone in suffering, to be cast aside by those once counted as brothers, is a test that every servant of God must endure. Yet in the same breath Paul declared, but the Lord stood with me. When all others failed, God remains faithful. Job, a man righteous before God, was not only afflicted with suffering, but was also betrayed by those who should have comforted him. They questioned his integrity, spoke words of condemnation, and misunderstood his trial. Even his own wife urged him to curse God and die. Yet in his isolation and betrayal, Job held fast to his faith, declaring, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. His trial was not for his destruction, but for his refining, and in the end, God restored him beyond what he had lost. Betrayal strips away false security, teaching the soul to find its refuge in God alone. It is a fire that burns away misplaced trust in man, leaving only the pure gold of dependence on the Almighty. The wounds inflicted by betrayal are deep, but they are not wasted. Those who have been betrayed are in the company of saints, prophets, and even the Lord himself. God does not waste betrayal. He uses it as a tool to shape those he calls, preparing them for a purpose far greater than they could have imagined. Suffering is a tool in the hand of God, shaping his servants into vessels fit for his purpose. No man is greatly used until he has first been deeply wounded. The fires of affliction burn away pride, self-reliance, and earthly attachments, leaving behind a heart that clings only to God. Those who would be strong in faith must first endure seasons of weakness, where every support is stripped away and only the grace of God remains. Suffering is not a sign of divine abandonment, but of divine refinement, for God does not waste the pain of his children. It is in the furnace of affliction that he prepares them for the work he has ordained. Job, a man righteous before God, was not spared from suffering. He lost his wealth, his children, and his health in a single stroke. Those who once respected him mocked him, his friends accused him, and even his own wife urged him to curse God and die. He sat in ashes, scraping his sores, his body broken, his soul crushed. Yet, in his suffering, he learned to see God as he had never seen him before. I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now mine eye seeth thee, he declared. His suffering was not purposeless. It brought him into a deeper knowledge of God, and in the end God restored him, not merely in earthly blessings, but in spiritual depth and understanding. Paul, the great apostle, was no stranger to suffering. Beaten, imprisoned, shipwrecked, stoned, and left for dead, he bore in his body the marks of one who had suffered much for Christ. Yet he did not count his suffering as a curse, but as a privilege. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, he wrote. His suffering produced endurance, deepened his faith, and taught him the sufficiency of God's grace. When he pleaded for the thorn in his flesh to be removed, God answered, "My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." The suffering did not leave him broken, but made him strong in the power of God. David, the anointed king, spent years in hardship before he ever sat upon the throne. He was hunted by Saul, forced to hide in caves, betrayed by those he trusted. The road to kingship was not lined with comfort, but with trials. Yet in those years of suffering, he learned to trust in God alone. His psalms, filled with cries of distress and songs of deliverance, were born from seasons of affliction. The man who would lead God's people first had to learn to be led by God in suffering. It was not in the palace, but in the wilderness, that he was shaped into the king after God's own heart. Joseph, betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused and imprisoned, knew the sting of suffering. His dreams of greatness seemed crushed beneath the weight of injustice. Yet, every trial was a step in God's divine plan. In prison he was refined. In hardship he learned humility. When the time came for him to stand before Pharaoh, he was not an arrogant youth, but a man who had been tested by suffering and found faithful. The years of affliction had prepared him to be a wise and merciful ruler, for he had learned that God's purposes are greater than man's pain. Jesus himself, the Son of God, was perfected through suffering. He was despised, rejected, falsely accused, and condemned. He bore the weight of sin upon his shoulders, endured the agony of the cross, and was forsaken by those he came to save. Yet it was through suffering that salvation was accomplished. Though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered. Scripture declares, his suffering was not without purpose. It was the means by which he brought redemption to the world. Those who follow him must also walk the path of suffering, for the servant is not above his master. Suffering humbles the soul, purging it of self-reliance and teaching it to depend wholly upon God. It silences pride, deepens faith, and produces a character that is steadfast and unshakable. The world despises suffering, seeing it as a sign of failure, but in the kingdom of God, suffering is a mark of preparation. Those whom God would use for great things must first be tested by deep affliction. Through suffering, they learn that their strength is not in themselves, but in the God who sustains them. The fire of suffering does not consume them, it refines them. The pain they endure is not meaningless, for God is at work in their trials, shaping them for his glory. Delay is one of the most trying tests God uses to refine his servants. When he gives a vision, a promise, or a calling, he seldom brings it to fulfillment immediately. Instead, he allows time to pass, often stretching into years, during which faith is tested, patience is cultivated, and self-sufficiency is stripped away. It is in the waiting that God prepares a soul, teaching it to trust in his perfect timing, rather than in its own understanding. Delay is not denial, nor is it a sign of neglect. It is divine preparation, ensuring that the vessel is ready before the appointed time of fulfillment. Those who would be greatly used by God must first learn to wait upon him. Abraham received a promise that he would be the father of many nations, yet he waited 25 long years before Isaac, the son of promise, was born. In those years, doubt and impatience tempted him. He tried to bring about the promise by his own means, taking Hagar as a wife and producing Ishmael. But this was not God's plan. The promise could not be fulfilled through human effort. It had to come through divine intervention. The delay was necessary, for through it, Abraham learned to trust in God alone. When Isaac finally came, it was clear that it was not by man's strength, but by God's faithfulness that the promise was fulfilled. Joseph received dreams of greatness, visions of his brothers bowing before him, yet instead of rising to power immediately, he was sold into slavery, cast into prison, and left to wait for years. Each passing year must have made the promise seem more distant, yet God was at work in the delay. In Potiphar's house, he learned leadership. In prison, he learned humility and wisdom. The dream was not denied. It was being prepared. When Pharaoh's call finally came, Joseph was not an arrogant youth, but a man refined by patience and suffering, ready to rule with wisdom and mercy. Moses was called to be the deliverer of Israel. Yet after his failed attempt to save his people in his own strength, he was sent to the wilderness for 40 years. In Egypt he had been a prince, powerful in words and deeds, but he was not yet fit for God's purpose. In the solitude of Midian, tending sheep, his pride was stripped away, his strength was broken, and he became a man who would lean entirely on God. When the time of deliverance finally arrived, Moses was no longer a self-reliant prince, but a humble servant, ready to lead God's people by faith. David was anointed as king while still a shepherd boy, yet he did not ascend to the throne immediately. Instead, he spent years running from Saul, hiding in caves, facing betrayal, and enduring hardship. The delay was not a mistake, but a means of shaping him into a king who would rule after God's own heart. Had he taken the throne too soon, he would not have been prepared for the weight of leadership. The hardships of waiting were essential in forming him into the man who would write psalms of trust and worship, who would lead Israel with a heart of devotion to God. Hannah longed for a child, yet year after year she remained barren. Her rival provoked her. Her prayers seemed unanswered, and her heart was heavy with sorrow. Yet in the waiting she learnt to pour out her soul before the Lord. When Samuel was finally born, he was not just any child, he was a prophet, dedicated to God from birth. The delay had a purpose, for in the waiting Hannah's heart was prepared to surrender her son completely to the Lord's service. The timing was not accidental. It was ordained for the greater purpose of raising a prophet for Israel. Even Jesus, though he was the Son of God, did not begin his public ministry immediately. For 30 years he lived in obscurity, waiting for the appointed time. Though he was perfect, he still submitted to the process of waiting, setting an example for those who would follow him. When he finally stepped into his calling, it was not a moment too soon or too late. It was exactly as the Father had ordained. His waiting was not wasted time, but divine preparation for the work he was sent to do. Delay teaches dependence. It uproots impatience and replaces it with trust. It removes self-sufficiency and instills a deep reliance on God's perfect timing. The waiting season is not a passive time, but a time of growth, refining, and deepening faith. Those who resist the lessons of delay often forfeit the strength that comes from endurance, but those who submit to it emerge ready for the task ahead. The waiting is not wasted, for in the unseen God is working. Every delay is purposeful, every postponement is preparation, and when the time of fulfillment comes, it will be clear that it was worth the wait. Loneliness is a furnace in which God refines those he calls. It is a trial that strips away earthly dependencies, revealing the insufficiency of human comfort and the all-sufficiency of God. Those whom God would use greatly must first learn to stand alone, not by their own strength, but by leaning entirely upon Him. Seasons of isolation are not signs of divine abandonment, but of divine preparation, teaching the heart to seek God above all else. When friends are few, when companions turn away, and when solitude presses upon the soul, it is then that a deeper communion with God is forged. Joseph knew the pain of loneliness. Separated from his family, betrayed by his brothers, and sold into slavery, he found himself in a foreign land, alone and forsaken. No father to guide him, no brother to stand beside him, no familiar face to offer comfort. Yet in that isolation, God was with him. The pit, the slave market, the prison, each was a place of solitude, yet each was also a place of divine presence. The loneliness did not destroy him. It deepened his reliance on God. Had he remained among his brothers, surrounded by familiarity and comfort, he would never have become the man God intended him to be. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness, tending sheep in solitude. Once a prince of Egypt, surrounded by power and prestige, he found himself alone in the desert, far removed from the grandeur of Pharaoh's court. It was in that solitude that God prepared him. The burning bush did not appear in the palace, but in the wilderness. Had Moses remained in the comfort of Egypt, he would not have learned the humility and dependence required to lead God's people. His isolation was not punishment, it was preparation. David, though anointed as king, spent years wandering in the wilderness, hiding in caves, cut off from his home and his people. The once celebrated warrior, the man after God's own heart, was now a fugitive, pursued by Saul, betrayed by those he trusted, and left to dwell in solitude. Yet, in those lonely years, he composed psalms of deep intimacy with God. His songs of worship were born from seasons of isolation, where he learned to find his joy not in the company of men, but in the presence of God. The throne would come, but first he had to learn to be alone with God. Elijah, the mighty prophet, stood alone on Mount Carmel, surrounded by false prophets and an apostate nation. He had no allies, no earthly support, no visible encouragement, yet he called down fire from heaven in the power of God alone. Later, in the cave at Horeb, he cried out in despair, believing himself to be the only faithful one left. But God met him there, not in the wind, nor in the earthquake, nor in the fire, but in the still, small voice. It was in solitude that Elijah encountered the whisper of God, learning that divine presence is not dependent on crowds or circumstances. John the Baptist lived in the wilderness, away from the comforts of society, preparing the way of the Lord in solitude. His ministry was not born in the synagogues of Jerusalem, but in the lonely places where he communed with God. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of one who had been with God in the quiet, away from distractions, shaped by solitude. His calling was great, but it required a season of isolation to prepare him for it. Paul, after his dramatic conversion, did not immediately begin his ministry. Instead, he spent years in obscurity, separated from the apostles, alone with God. It was in that season of solitude that he received divine revelation, that his understanding was deepened, that his soul was strengthened. The man who would write much of the New Testament, who would suffer for Christ's name, who would stand before kings, first had to be alone with God. Even Jesus himself withdrew to solitary places to pray. Though surrounded by crowds, though followed by disciples, he often sought the wilderness, the quiet hills, the lonely places where he could be alone with the Father. Before he began his public ministry, he spent 40 days in the wilderness, alone, fasting, praying, resisting the enemy. In Gethsemane, though his disciples were near, he was alone in his anguish, bearing the weight of the coming cross. Loneliness did not break him, it strengthened him. Loneliness is not a curse, but a calling. It is in solitude that faith is tested and deepened. It is in isolation that hearts learn to hear the voice of God more clearly. The man or woman who would do great things for God must first learn to walk alone, not in despair, but in the confidence that they are never truly alone. The crowd may disappear, friends may depart, but God remains. The servant of God who has learned to stand alone with him will never fear the absence of men. Those who embrace the wilderness of loneliness will find that it is in those places that God does his greatest work in them.